Morning, everybody. We will go ahead and get started with our webinar for today. So we are thankful for your participation in our webinar. And today we will talking about the difference between high performance pigments and classical pigments and other ways to classify them. We are recording this session, so all of those of you in attendance will receive a link to the recording as well as the PDF of the presentation. So feel free to share that with your colleagues on your teams. We love to get the word out. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to go ahead and use the chat box, and I'll address them at the end of the presentation. However, if that's not your thing, that's okay. You can reach out to me directly with your question, and I'd be happy to help. With that, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to take myself off of camera for the presentation. So today we're talking about the high performance versus classical pigments. So it's kind of a general topic, but I thought it was be a good segue into get a better understanding of some of the terminology that might be used and some of the definitions that you might have heard along the way. But from a brief history perspective, color has always been part of all of our surroundings, going way back. The earliest use of colorants were found in the cave paintings and other historic things like cloth dyeing. But however, these were derived from plants and animals and various minerals to get those colors. Some of the more natural pigments that you probably know can be found from blueberries with the anthrocyan, carotene, of course, from carrots, and chlorophyll. We all know in our green leafy items. However, the natural sources, they do have the drawbacks, just like everything does. They are typically weak in strength. Their colors may not be as brilliant as you would like, as we see today, of course. They're not permanent in color, and from a dispersion perspective, they are much harder in texture. So if we were to bring those into today's world, they would be harder to disperse. Which of course then brings about the synthetic manufacture and refining pigments, because they came about to be able to improve upon the weaknesses of the natural types of colorant sources. What resulted was pigments that always have better strength, certainly much more uniform because they're synthetically created. And then also there are some cleaner tones and softer textures for making a better and more productive type of dispersion. Today's reality shows us that the industry of pigments is more or less a mature industry. Not a lot of new product development is going to be seen in the near future. What we do see is improved pigments that are currently out there, always looking for higher performance or offering a better value. Um, but most likely not too many CIs that'll come in. Where we do see some additional growth comes from using more specialty pigments or more effect pigments in formulations. Those allow us to be a little bit more creative in what we create, to expand that color space, but also to make new color spaces from existing pigments. So again, the goal here would be to continue to expand what you can do with color. And from a organic, inorganic pigment perspective, the availability of colorants at at the current point in time is limited from the color space, but we broaden that with effect pigments. So I titled this discussion about high performance versus classical pigments, but there are many ways that we talk about pigments, depending on who the audience is, and who is having the discussion. So I just wanted to give you some ideas of what you'll hear in different conversations. So of course, high performance versus classical. Sometimes it might be specialized versus commodity, high tech versus conventional. Of course, we always talk about organic versus inorganic, pigment versus the dye, color versus the effect, new pigments versus old-fashioned pigments, breakthrough uh, pigments versus well-established types of pigments. So there are many ways to classify. In my time, I've not found um, a very good way to describe completely a type of pigment and really classify it in terms of some bucket of that you can call it. So this is why we talk about things in more generalities as we go forward. But in general, these types of differences can be used to talk about it. Some things to consider when we talk about high performance, it doesn't necessarily or it does denote that that particular pigment is going to have some enhanced durability or other performance properties like heat stability and chemical resistance. Typically, we apply those to organic pigments rather than inorganic pigments, only because with organic pigments there is quite a variety of performance that you can find in an organic pigment. However, inorganic pigments by their nature are actually high performance. And also, cost alone is never going to be a determining factor. It's one of the key ones, of course. I'm not going to deny that, but it is it's not necessarily going to be the determining factor when choosing a colorant for your formulation. As you can probably tell, the distinctions of all these classes are not always consistent, and they can cause some confusion. So, a couple of some examples that I have below demonstrate that. So, the phthalocyanate pigments, they do have excellent fastness characteristics, like the high performance pigments, but they typically are put in the classical or commodity category because they have a lower cost in use, and they are very much used in what is considered some lower cost application areas uh, in there. So, and then within the difference between, there's a broad range of durability, as I mentioned, between the organic and the inorganic types of pigments. So it gets a little fuzzy with that respects. And then the two other big key areas is really application dependent as well as the surface treatment. So both of these influence that final performance, and can really muddy up the waters when you're trying to put it in a class or give it a description. So one of the biggest issues is of inorganic pigments, which are high performance by their nature, is just the availability of the chemistries or the colors that you can find. Not to mention they're going to be lower in strength as well. The value of use can differ depending on who is assessing it. Is that assessment coming from a technical person who might see more options that you can draw out of that pigment, or is it coming from the commercial side where they're really just looking at at a a pound for pound difference between one grade or and another, or one product or another? Um, Typically classical or commodity pigments gets that nomenclature primarily because the chemistry behind it is fairly basic. There's little to no confidential know-how, and the processes that aren't really high tech. So that's one aspect of getting a name of classical or commodity pigments. On the flip side, high performance or specialized tend to still have quite a bit of confidential, high tech production know how that go into those. And far as investments required, these are a lot bigger investments to be able to create the process for these types of pigments. So that's a little bit of behind the scenes of how these get to be different classifications. As we push forward, everything is going to be trying to push towards commodity. Um, Higher volumes and capacities are being seen in the industry today. All manufacturers are looking to economize that manufacture, whether it be through the process or the location of that manufacturing. Sustainable solutions are always coming up and being applied to the manufacturer. Substitutions are always in people's minds, both on the customer end as well as on the manufacturing end. And then this is a global market, so there are many regions that require these colorants, and that brings economies of scales, but it also brings a lot more complexities into how you approach those particular marketplaces. Really, the only true commodity is the TiO2, carbon black, and iron oxide. Those are when you look at what the marketplace looks like by a tonnage perspective, those make up about 90% of that tonnage. So we've seen this one before. I use this a lot. It helps it helps to be able to clarify and put into buckets some of these things in here. But there are other ways, as I shown before. Sometimes we want to take a closer look at organic versus inorganic. And those really go by the chemistries are very different in how you're prepared. A couple of key things to consider is particle size. Usually inorganics are going to have a larger particle size versus the organics. That's where you get a lot of that opacity and hiding aspect from the inorganics. From a oil absorption perspective or dispersibility, the organics are going to have a higher oil absorption, so they're kind of require a little bit more dispersant to be able to best disperse those. Definitely a difference in color. Organics, as you know, can be offer up a very wide palette of bright and clean hues. Organics, because of the minimal amount of chemistries that are produced, the color is less dense and less intense in there. Strength, of course, is always going to be very different. And then, of course, cost of dollar per pound, we'll see some differences here. Again, I've shared this chart before, some additional ways to distinguish between categories. Again, all related to performance. We've got a couple of categories that straddle both of those, as I mentioned earlier, in my examples of how the lines get a little bit blurred. Phthalo blues and greens, as well as naphthol reds, straddle both of these because they do have a lot of the properties that look like a high performance one, but they are typically priced in the more classical categories. So all pigments are going to have a variety of physical properties associated with them, and it's each one of these and the combination of them that really will directly impact the performance of that pigment in your application. So it's really important to match the product with your application. Not so much of what grade it falls into, whether it was created for plastics or coatings or inks or some other application. It's really making sure that it has the right properties for your formulation. So we've gone through a pigment selection process in the past, but I added a few more things to consider along the way. So we know that, from a pigment manufacturer, I always make sure that the colorant chosen is technically valuable to you as the customer, because it has to perform correctly in your application. Every market is going to have their unique set of requirements that we have to match up with those pigments. And then here's some additional things to consider. Even in each pigment class, you'll find a variety of performance, with at least one grade with a higher performance characteristic, maybe more than one. And this is all due to how we finish the pigment. And finishing is either a surface treatment or the actual mechanical processes of finishing. They will move the performance in one direction or another. And these are the ones that we want to make sure that the resulting properties from that pigment is matched up to your application and formulation. Again, here the degree of performance depends on the demands that you have. Um, there is an expectation that pigments are increasing expectations from you as a customer. You're always looking for more cost-effective, environmentally friendly solutions. You want them to last longer, and you want them to do much more than protect and beautify your pigment. So there's much more value that our customers are seeking out of that pigment. And we, as the manufacturer and developer, we're always looking to find ways to add that value to the pigment. So there's a many list of pigment selection and process. Obviously, color and effect are the key areas where you start, but then to consider what kind of application that you're putting it into, what kind of compliance, and of course, cost, which is the dollar per pound, but also the value. What does it bring to your formulation? And then all of the various performance attributes that your formulation must have, and how that pigment would impact that particular performance. So the added functionality that I spoke about here is something that we as pigment manufacturers are always looking to place on our pigments. However, that what that functionality is can differ between from person to person or industry and industry. It all depends on who is asking. So it's my job to make sure that we have that conversation to say what's missing from your system right now, and how can we help to bring that to you to be able to get those properties in there. So there's always going to be that back and forth of exchange to make sure that it's very clear what they're looking for. Sometimes we all know what we all know what we don't know. So it's that conversation of back and forth that allows us to pull out what the really needed requirements are going to be. So the true cost, excuse me, the true cost of a raw material is based on that total formulation, and that's what we call the cost in use. It considers the price and the amount of that pigment or colorant that's needed to make the formulation meet the customer's expectations. So all of this goes into play to make sure that you, as the formulator, can make sure that your end product meets as many of those expectations as you can possibly achieve. So as far as the pigment is concerned, organic pigments or inorganic pigments, they are produced based on a chemistry formulation. And that initial synthesis is what we call in the pigment industry as the crude. This is the base of the pigment, where we take it from there, apply various finishing steps to it to get the properties that we're looking for from that particular one. So we talk about finishing as a general category, but there's actually two parts to that. Finishing is usually mechanical energy placed on it, whether it be drying or milling, and that really impacts the primary particle size. Surface treatment is more of a chemical finishing technique, and that usually impacts the dispersibility and the properties that come along with that dispersibility. So we talk about pigments and dyes. So in this, we've seen this chart before, where 75% or so of the physical properties of that pigment come from just the chemistry, and then the remainder comes from the adjustment that we do on the finishing side. However, dyes, they are they're not pigments. They will dissolve completely into the medium that they're put in, so 100% of the performance comes from the chemistry. There is no finishing or surface treatment on a dye. So the colorant selection process really is a combination of the product designer who gets something from the end customer. I want, my product to look like this. They work with the formulator of the of that particular formulation, and then it's always important to include, where possible, the pigment manufacturer, because they will have the most information and knowledge about the pigment. So I found a quote from a colleague of mine in an article, an industry article, and I really, really appreciated this one as a pigment manufacturer. Um, and this is by Paul Nowak of CQV, a very dear friend of mine. It states the holy grail for a pigment supplier is to develop a colorant that can provide a new, fresh, never before seen, widely applicable visual experience that is globally accepted across multiple markets, application, and product lines. Truly a holy grail from a pigment manufacturer. This basically states is, if we could create something that is useful for everybody in every region, in every application, we would have done our jobs. Obviously, that's not possible, but it's so nice to see something like this in print, because it just depicts how difficult of a job it is for us to be able to create something that meets as many needs as possible. Thus, the difference of different grades. So I mentioned that working with pigment manufacturers, because we have a much deeper knowledge and understanding of the technology that's at hand, and are best positioned to make sure that we recommend the optimized pigment for your specific application. So the combination of the three areas really does lead to successful product introductions in the marketplace. So as far as selecting a pigment or a colorant, what is your approach? Are you more in the maze where you're kind of, stopping and changing directions along the way? Or do you spend the time to list all of your must wants and nice to haves kinds of things with respect to your formulation and needs? Um, there are both out there in there, and they have their ways of doing it. So we, as a Sudarshan, would really like to offer up as much information as we can to make sure that your development process is as smooth and successful as possible. Um, Again, you really need to balance everything in here. So this is nothing new, but it's just a reminder to consider all aspects of what you're doing when you're putting a new formulation together. So we've done these webinars over the last 3 years here, all in an effort to bring you more information and knowledge to your formulation so that you can best select in there. So we're always here to help in there. So we appreciate all your attention with respect to the webinars. So one area that we always are asking is as far as expanding the color space. There's always an expectation out there, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, for ongoing innovation, and we truly have a very active R&D department looking for those innovations. the stylists out there, the that are working with customers and trying to translate the color that they're looking for. There's always looking to expand the portfolio that they have to work with. They try to experiment with new combinations to get to new color spaces or new effects along the way. In my opinion, some color spaces that are the smallest, have the smallest amount of coverage are orange, green, and violet. There's just not as many as probably some would like to have in that area. But there's more than one way to get to a color space. But these, if you want to be truly in this space, are a little bit more limited than others. However, within a color index, there's always the opportunity to um, expand your color space, because within each color space, we as manufacturers have the ability to push the color space within each side. And I have some examples to show. So the yellow space is quite filled with options. Different technologies and chemistries are available for a variety of application areas in there. And so you've got a number of ones that can push you to the green side or to the red side, depending on where you would like to be and what kind of properties that you're looking for. When we look at a few specific color indexes, a couple of here that I brought, Pigment Yellow 138, for example, there is a very green shade and there is a very red shade out there. So you might want to choose one or the other depending on what kind of space that you're looking for, as well as but yet keeping that performance of that chemistry. Couple of inorganic spaces that have that same breadth of color, yellow 53 and brown 24. Both of these also we can push to green or red side depending on how we get to that end point and bring those metal oxides together. So there's ways of expanding your color space, but yet staying in the same chemistry and performance area. Orange space, as I mentioned, this is a fairly limited amount of space in today's world, as well as options for availability. Red space is, again, like the yellow, is very filled with a lot of chemistries, so you'll be able to choose your color space based off of the chemistry and performance that you require for your application. And then similarly within the color spaces, options to further expand and keep the performance and chemistry that you need. Red 170, red 264, and red 122 also have the ability to move the color space, some to the more yellow side, some to the more blue side. Green, as you can see, is is very limited in what you can do from the green side. However, green 7, we can again also push yellow or blue depending on the finishing techniques that we do. Blue is is a fairly full range, offering options in the green shade and the red shade. Violet, as I mentioned, is a little bit more, is also pretty limited. Although the violet's color space is not necessarily a huge in terms of volume in the industries. Primarily, these are typically used more as shaders or tinters. However, there are options to be able to do that. And within the color index space, Violet 23, for example, we have products and technology to push it to the red side as well as to the blue side. So making a pigment, there's always going to be challenges that we have to face day in, day out. And these are nothing new, but these also apply to the more basic raw materials, to also some of the specialty intermediates that are required to create these pigments. Changes in the supply chain, who, what, when, and how. That is a day-to-day um, uh, fact that our supply chain on the raw material side have to take into consideration as they um, support manufacturing of pigments. Pricing, again, that's all over the place and changes for different reasons. And all areas from the basic of raw materials through to energy and transportation. All of these have seen ups and downs and swings in the pricing area. Availability. Um, Different organizations have different views on year-end inventory management. There are acts of God that happen, and other issues that might make availability more limited. Then there's always regional political influences that happen that push one area or another into a different place than we're used to. Consumer preferences are always changing, so we continue to follow them to make sure that we have what's required for the end consumer, as you do as well. New technologies. As I mentioned, we have a very well staffed and very busy R&D department that are always looking for those new technologies. Myself, as an intermediary technical support folks, I bring your needs back to our R&D and really pose a lot of what if questions to them to make sure that we have explored all of the options that are available for us. And then there's always going to be environmental and safety regulations that continue to change along the way that we have to deal with. A lot of environmental drivers are happening in today's world that really can influence what we do, how we do it, and how we serve our customers. A few of the major drivers that we are working on currently is in the implementation of HCP limits. These primarily in Europe. However, Japan has already implemented them. So we, as a Sudarshan, we take a look at these, and we typically know that Japan is usually the first region to make such changes. So we keep a very close eye on what they do. And then we try to implement them right away and apply those to all of our products, not just regional specific products, if possible. We talked earlier in the year here about chrome and yellow and Mali oranges. These are have a sunset date in Europe. The whole entire market is looking like it's dwindling, which then forces some changes in there. So organic pigments are starting to make their make it again make their way into that space to replace those chromes and Mali oranges in there. So these are just things that happen along the way. Another one that is being proposed in Europe for PCB reduction from its current limit to 25 to 10 parts per million. So all of these drivers we follow very, very closely and make sure that our products are where they need to be as early as we need to be, because we know they will, if they start in Japan, Europe will be quick to follow, the US will quick to follow after that. So we want to make sure that we are prepared. Some additional incentives that we're following. Of course, nano characterization is something that has been in the industry for a little while now. So we're making sure that we are compliant with all of those. Some specific REACH dossiers on a few pigment classes are being adjusted and studied. Some other initiatives that we just have seen most recently in the US is a Washington State initiative that has stated that they would like they want to ban the manufacturing of chlorinated colorants. This is very vague. It's still very unclear how this will impact the overall industry. there's a large number of colorants that could be impacted by this. There are many industry groups that are involved in trying to sort this out. Specifically, it does speak to coatings and inks, but not plastics. And it also speaks to pigments and not dyes. So the message I want to leave with you on this particular area, this is an ever-changing scene that requires cooperation and collaboration of all of us, you as customers, we as a manufacturer. We like to hear any news that you do, and we share that back and forth as well, because we want to make sure that we are where we need to be in preparation for any of these initiatives that might come to pass. So we started out talking about high performance versus classical. So I'll leave you with a few examples to consider as you're deciding on colorants for your formulation. This chart is 3 various ink grades of Pigment Red 122 and the TDSs that come along with it. So on your far left-hand side is one for a water-based ink. The middle one is for a solvent-based. And the far right one is the one that's created for digital inks. So they're all ink in general. They are finished to specific formulation types. There is some indication from the physical properties that show up on TDSs that can tell you a little bit about how they would perform in your formulation. And I'll share that with you in the next slide. So this formulation is an NC ink solvent-based formulation where we took a look at a number of red 122s regardless of the grade. And the 3 that I spoke about in the previous slide are here. So in the when we take a look at viscosity, this water-based ink grade has a lower viscosity than the actual solvent-based or solvent-based ink product in here. So, but yet they both deliver a very similar gloss to the dispersion. If we look at gloss, the difference between the solvent-based one and the digital ink one, we get a big improvement in the gloss response in this formulation with very little impact on the dispersion viscosity. So again, it goes back to what you're looking for and matching up to the the finishing. So goes back to that one statement I made earlier in the presentation that in each pigment class, in this case the Pigment Red 122, you're going to find a grade or two that has a different performance or a more desirable performance aspect of it versus something other. So all of the finishing techniques that we put upon these red 122s result in a different performance aspect of it. So matching the actual the proper pigment to your needs is what we're here for, to make sure that you have the optimized formulation. Next, so we'll go to on the classical side, Pigment Red 57-1. Same idea here. We have 3 ink grade 57-1s. The one on the left-hand side is the solvent-based one. One in the middle is for water-based, and the one on the left is also another solvent-based aspect of it. Same idea here. Same NC ink formulation was used to evaluate. We see a difference in viscosity between these 2 grades, as well as viscosity and gloss between those 2 grades. Same base chemistry, Pigment Red 57-1. It's all in the finishing steps that we do that to create these products for the ultimate intended property, but they will give unique properties in each formulation as well. So there might be something there that you might want to take advantage of for your formulation. Same idea, same class of pigments with the pigment finishing. Now, if we switch over to looking at color space and comparing high performance and classical, here we are taking a look at the magenta color space. On the left-hand side is the classical. It's a red 57-1. Very similar color space is occupied by the pigment red 122, which is, of course, a high performance. By the TDS, you can see where those nomenclatures reside, and primarily that's in heat resistance. Classical red 57-1 has a lower heat resistance, so its applications are much more limited because of that heat resistance. On the flip side, the red 122 has a high heat resistance, so it's available to be used in a lot more application areas. And just to give a visual to that heat resistance difference between the two chemistries, here's the data from our heat resistance test method that we perform on each of these pigments. And you can see the red 57-1 quickly rises to its maximum of 240. Delta E of maximum of 3 is acceptable. But there is a very steep rise from 220 to 240 degrees for the 57-1, whereas the red 57-1 just casually increases, but still well below the maximum delta E. Switching color spaces to orange. On the left-hand side is the classical orange 34. On the right-hand side is the high performance orange 64. Same idea here. Heat resistance is much lower, and on the classical side versus the high performance. And we also see warpage on the orange 34 is not suitable for an application where warpage is important, whereas the orange 64 is very suitable for applications that have that specification. Heat stability, again, just describes the difference between the two chemistries. A very rapid rise in the orange 34 that goes from 200 to 220, which is why at the 200, which is our starting level, we classify the pigment orange the orange 34 at a maximum of 200 degrees C for heat stability. Carrying that same color space onto the coating sides. This is a powder coating application here where we're taking a look at the overbake stability, very similar to the heat stability on plastics. Here we take a look at two high performance and one classical, which is the orange 34. So the first thing, we definitely see the strength improvement for the orange 34, which is a general characteristic of the classical pigments, having a higher strength than the high performance. However, it does have a poor overbake stability. So Orange 34 is not a good candidate for a powder coating application unless you can keep the heat down. However, some of the newer technologies that use UV curing, this might be an option for that type of formulation where the temperature doesn't get very high, because you need to protect the part from high temperatures as well. So I do have to clarify that particular one. Now, if we take a look at the two remaining high performance aspects of it, we also see some differences between the two. So in general, for an overall orange space, the orange 36 is going to be a better option for this type of powder coating formulation. However, if you're in a particular coating space, There might be an advantage to choosing the orange 64 if you are in a more pastel type one, or this ends up being more of a brown type coloring with the carbon black. All depends on how flexible your toolbox will be. So the technical data sheets will tell you a lot, but they also have their limitations. So here are technical data sheets for Pigment Blue 15.3. I've pulled one for plastics, one coatings in the middle, and an ink one on the far right side. And so remember, we talked about 75% of the performance comes from the chemistry, and the remainder is the surface treatment that we place on it. However, when you look at a technical data sheet and you really just take a look at the heat stability, we see, oh, well, these look very, very different in that aspect of it. The reason being is the heat stability quoted on these TDSs are really a function of the formulation that it is in. So when I put each of these into the plastics heat stability test method, that gets the 300-degree rating for the 2789. All three products are fine at the 300-degree rating. So again, that chemistry that comes in here. It's the chemistry rather than the formulation that the chemistry is in that dictates what that ultimate heat stability is going to be. And then if we take a look at the same product, just in different applications, so this is our Pigment Blue 15.4 Sudafast 2796, a TDS for plastics and a TDS for pigment coatings. Again, we see the same difference here. It's the same product, but yet on the plastic side, it has a higher heat stability than the quoted on the coating side, same exact product. So again, it goes back to that what was it tested in for that one. It's also good to note that the values that are quoted on TDSs are very specific to that formulation and that test conditions. Altering the formulation, which that's an obvious one, and and conditions can change that number, that ultimate number. So using it more as a guide versus an absolute. So some of the challenges that we see for the future is, as I mentioned very early in the talk, that new chemistries are more than likely not going to be seen. So we want to be able to improve the quote unquote old pigments. So new manufacturing processes to get more economies, enhancing of the properties of those particular pigments. So that's a big effort on our part in our R&D to make sure that we have those available for the future. We are always following the essential E's. We want to make sure that the product is effective for that particular application. Economy is always key on our mind. We want to make sure that we bring value to you as the customer. We also want to make sure that we have a wide field of application. So this is why we take a look at different grades in each application to make sure that we're not missing something. Ecology, of course, we're always making sure that we are paying close attention to environmental and toxicology safety to make sure that we have the right products for today's world. But it is the never-ending story. The pigments of today will become the conventional standards of tomorrow, with those of tomorrow having to be invented now. So it's a never-ending story. It will continue on in the future to make sure that we have what today's environment requires of a pigment. Just a quick look at the Sudarshan brands and where the chemistries fit in. I know many of you have visited our website. I encourage you to do so and scout around. You can find more information about your application in the Pigments tab, or if you're just looking for information on a specific color index, you can use the Pigment Finder box. That's a good way to find the products. Our North American team is here to help at any time, so please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'd be happy to help. So next up, we are going to take the summer off for a little R&R, and we will be back at it in August. I'm working hard to line up what our webinar series will look like going into the end of the year and into the beginning of the year. So stay tuned for the topic for the August webinar. That will come a bit later, and the additional series will be expanded out as we go forward. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us for the webinar, and I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have.